Thank you everyone for coming. If you can't hear me, please let me know at any point if my voice drops too softly. And I think I've hugged everyone in the audience thus far, but if you haven't gotten a hug yet, please let me know at the end of the reading. I'm very grateful to be here. It's my joy, it's my honor, and I'm grateful that all of you have come. And hello to everyone watching online. I wrote my first creative verses here at Writers and Books sometime in the early 80s, and Writers and Books has truly nurtured my aspirations for a literary life for the past 40 years. And I know that many of you in this room share that as well. And Writers and Books has also supported me throughout many phases of my personal growth and my personal life. So I wouldn't want to do this anywhere else. And in honor of friendship and community, I'd like to begin my reading with two poems George Seferis wrote for friends. The first, Letter to Rex Warner, honors the British anti-fascist novelist and Philhellene, who served as the director of the British Institute in Athens during the Greek Civil War. And the second is a bawdy limerick dedicated to novelist George Theotokos, whom Seferis nicknamed Fabrice. Letter to Rex Warner, a resident alien of Storrs, Connecticut, for his 60th birthday. When we met in the soccer field that had experienced brazen slaughter, you were talking about hunting wild geese in the despotate of the hermaphrodites. I was returning from a marble stadium where the wounded marathon runner who volunteered for the war saw slingshots sailing through blood. This is how I attuned myself to you, and we became friends. We went to a country so badly ruined by war that even the children's dolls were crippled. The light was so quick and strong, it chewed through everything and turned it to bones. We strolled among bicycles and paper airplanes. Although we noticed the colors, our conversation strayed toward that unhealed terror. Many years passed, and I found you again, in soil teeming with flowers, where sometimes the poison ivy lurks, where studious young people learn to pronounce scripture and love's labyrinth. You always honored Homer and his generation. A squirrel scampered up a giant tree, higher and higher, a spasming curlicue, and you watched him laughing. Our life is constant separation and the most challenging presence. Now, in the tightly woven metropolis, I think of you again. Everything is television, and it's hard to touch anything up close. Within the heat of the electric night, within a pristine loneliness of the sea's depths, the illuminated skyscrapers display their shiny windows, like the skin of a huge sea creature as it flings itself into the foam. The multicolored nation that fills the skyscrapers, immeasurable, pushing and shoving, departed about this time for other pleasures and agonies. They were emptied out, not a soul remained. Like the nests of that sparrow, the one dubbed a lover of company, Phileteris socius, the multicellular ones. You see them in thorny acacia shrubs, or in a museum if you're looking for them. I rued the vine, murmured the prophet Jonah while gazing at the great Nineveh. This phrase reminds me of ecstatic visions that assembled in his daily work, bulls and horses with gaping mouths and a switchblade tongue. The resurrection, a fisher in reality, like the expat El Greco, speaking in a tongue unintelligible to all. Or that sculptor who saw the sky as red and battled with that insatiable space where the statues crumbled in his hands, smaller and smaller and tinier until nothing. Many years have sunk into the depths since the time when a young man named Megacles held an athlete's flask draped on his left arm, and in his 3 fingers held a pomegranate and dedicated it tenderly to Persephone. Now, on your 60th, I can't offer you anything besides this useless twittering. Nonetheless, I'll say that the company-loving sparrows saved me and goaded me into their thick herd. And this poem was written in New York City and Princeton in the late 60s. This round's on Seferis, for Fabrice, who's on the brig Argo, while the call girl lifts her cheeks for a whirl, and he, surrounded by ghosts feeling frisky, looks off in the distance and sips his whiskey. Book of Exercises 2 is a multi-genre compilation of drafts and completed works drawn from Seferis's diaries and notebooks spanning 1931 to 1971. It was published posthumously in 1976, and although a few poems have appeared in English, the whole book was never translated into English. George Seferis, who lived from 1900 to 1971, was a Greek poet, a diplomat, and literary critic who won the Nobel Prize in Literature in 1963. As a diplomat for the Greek nation, Seferis served during the Metaxas dictatorship of the 1930s, in exile throughout World War II, during the Greek Civil War and the Cyprus crisis. Though he did reveal his political leanings and personal beliefs in his writings as a cultural critic, he represented the Greek government throughout numerous political, fiscal, and constitutional crises of the 20th century. Only at the end of his life, after he had retired from an ambassadorship to the United Kingdom, did he risk his reputation by making public statements against the dictatorship of the colonels, which seized control of the democratic state in 1967. Because of his outspokenness, when Seferis died in 1971 during the dictatorship, his funeral became a site of national mourning and resistance. This book has always stood apart from the poet's collected works because it contains material such as satire, erotica, and playful humor that was considered unbecoming of a neutral statesman and a serious national poet. Seferis himself began compiling this manuscript in 1963 when he returned to Athens from London, retired from the Ministry of Foreign Service, and intended to dedicate himself to finishing literary projects. It was his custom to gather poems written on the road during his diplomatic service and edit, compile, and release them before life's next challenge. However, he was stopped in the middle of this process for Book of Exercises 2 by the news that he was a serious contender for the Nobel Prize. He and his publisher, Icaros Press, deemed that the material would not have been received well by the Nobel Committee, nor public opinion, and so the book was set aside. After Seferis went on to win the Nobel Prize, he was invited to Harvard and Princeton as a visiting scholar, at which time he completed other projects, such as his own translations into modern Greek of T.S. Eliot and other British, French, and American poets, as well as biblical works like the Book of Revelations and the Song of Songs. At the same time, he suffered throughout the late 1960s with ill health and died after surgery in 1971. Book of Exercises 2 remained unfinished. Seferis' editor, George Savides, completed the book in 1976, and it was largely ignored by his main translators, Edmund Keeley and Philip Sherrard, in their periodic reissues of the collected works in English. And they justified this choice based on critical statements Seferis had made about the act of publishing a writer's, quote, remainders after death. I discovered this book about 20 years ago when I was beginning my dissertation on Seferis' poetry, and it seemed mystifying and tantalizing that after decades and decades of scholarship about Seferis, these poems would have been left aside. But perhaps that's because they remained in Greek and the bulk of literary criticism about Seferis has been in English. My dissertation was about the poetics of a lost homeland in Seferis' poetry. He was born in the Ottoman Empire, grew up in the Greek community, living on the Aegean coast of Turkey. And when he was 14, World War I broke out, and his father sent him to Athens and then to Paris to be educated. He never returned to his ancestral home. In his youth, his family's homes and properties were seized and destroyed, and his family dispersed and perished. Yet, because of his family's relative wealth compared to destitute refugees and their political connections, he was never considered a refugee artist. Yet it always seemed obvious to me that this trauma is one of the hallmarks of his poetry, which is what I argued in my dissertation. Book of Exercises 2 contains poems written when Seferis returned to Turkey as a diplomat, as well as musings on his peripatetic childhood and his life. And I'll read 3 poems now that reflect the poignancy of a lost home. Argo. I learned my fables among boats, not from travelers, nor from mariners, nor from the others who waited on the quays, disembarked, perpetually searching their pockets for a cigarette. The faces of boats inhabit my life. Some of them see with one eye like the Cyclops, motionless upon the sea's mirror. Others move like sleepwalkers, dangerously. Still others were taken by the sleep of the deep, wood, ropes, sails, chains, and all. In the cool little garden house, among the cottonwood and eucalyptus trees, close to the rusty windmill, close to the yellow fountain with one lonely carp, in the cool little house with the aroma of reeds, I found a boat's compass. It revealed the atmospheric angels who occupy the noonday silence. Selva Oscura. When I close my eyes, I find myself in an expansive darkness, the color of dawn. I sense it on your fingertips. Forget the lie that helped you live. Bare your feet, bare your eyes. Very few things remain when we've bared ourselves, but in the end, we can see them exactly as they are. When I close my eyes, I always find myself on a path, the yards ruined to the right and left, and in the corner, the house with window panes beaten by the sun, empty. I thought of your fingertips beating against the panes. I thought of your heart beating behind the panes, and the very few things that set a man apart from others and are never overcome. You don't know anything because you looked at the sun. Your blood dripped into the black leaves of the laurel bush. I see the nightingale and the marbled moon of evenings past, when I dragged your blood into the river, dyeing it red. I ponder, when I ponder my veins in the mystery of your hands, guiding carefully, descending step by step. When I close my eyes, I find myself in an expansive garden. And according to Seferis' editor, this poem was written on the 40th anniversary of Seferis leaving his homeland. I wandered, got tired, wrote very little, but returning home was always on my mind, 40 years. Man is an infant at all ages, in the cradle's tenderness and brutality. Like the shoreline and the sea, everything else is erased. Our embrace and the sound of our voice. Seferis was an ardent proponent for what is called Demotic Greek, or the Greek spoken by people across the Greek diaspora. Demotic Greek stood against Purified Greek, a formal constructed language containing elements of ancient and biblical Greek. This conservative Greek was the official language of the state and only dropped in 1976 after Seferis' death. In his professional life, he used Purified Greek, and in his artistic life, he wrote in Demotic Greek, and often celebrated Greek dialects and traditional poetic forms. In the 30s and 40s, he became well known for bringing the modernist style of T.S. Eliot, Paul Valéry, and Ezra Pound into a Greek context. His most widely read work is called Mythhistorema, or Myth History, inspired by Homer's Odyssey and T.S. Eliot's The Wasteland. In a series of 24 poems, like the 24 books of the Odyssey, a collective voice wanders a broken and war-torn landscape in the Aegean Sea. Book of Exercises 2 offers a view on Seferis' creative process, with drafts from Mythhistorema that are set in Athens and not the islands. And these poems show Seferis experimenting with the mythical framework of the Oresteia rather than the Odyssey, and contain direct quotes from the Aeschylus plays Agamemnon and the Humanities. In the first poem I'll read now, called The Last Chorus, the modern Athenians are the inheritors of a diseased tradition, represented by the voice of Clytemnestra, offering Agamemnon all the riches of the Aegean Sea before she murders him. And in the second poem, which is untitled, we advance forward to the end of the Oresteia myth cycle, when the Furies have ceased pursuing Orestes for killing his mother, Clytemnestra, and have agreed to transform naked vengeance into punishment by a civil law code. The Furies become the kindly ones who will be a protective force watching over the citizens of Athens. And in the poem I'll read, the citizens of 1930s Athens process through the streets honoring the now pacified Furies. The final chorus. An altered folktale. That's what we're paying off. All the others too. Like our elders who held canes and spoke serenely and were reduced to ashes. The murky bath, the net, the knife, the deep-hued purple, and the voice that questioned the sea. Who could drain it? These symbols nourished our life. We imbibed our love drop by drop. It seemed a poison pill to build our immunity, until the end came and our love was eradicated. Truly, our people always guided us with prudence. Enough of life, this life, encircled by Mounts Pendeli and Hymettus and Parnitha. But the roots don't wither easily. They don't easily disappear. The defilements of madness, of injustice, of vain pursuits. We're paying off an altered folktale on these very same rocks for 3,000 years and more. Pity those who are yet to come. At the head, soldiers at arms in uniform and crests. Next, mothers and children will proceed with piety, heads bowed, without shouting and tears. Above all, women should be decorous in dresses and makeup. Elders will follow with the grandeur prescribed by our laws. Lastly, young men and women dressed in exercise attire. Braziers and disrespectful gestures are prohibited. Meeting point in front of the Zapion at 8 p.m. The procession will leave in order, following Amalias Avenue and Dionysius the Areopagiite Street until the gates of the Acropolis. The torchbearers will give the sign for the propitiatory cry every 100 steps. The police will make sure to prevent the circulation of vehicles, chestnuts, pumpkin seeds, and megaphones. The respectful Furies promised the bishop high priest to return to their cave and remaining there to protect the city until the end of time. The god of Greece ordered it. Cry out now, in joyful song and dance. Now, in joyful song and dance. Cry out. In his diplomatic posts of the late 1930s and 40s, Seferis witnessed Europe's confusion, containment strategies, and courage in standing up to the Axis powers' belligerence. The next set of poems I'll read come from Seferis' experiences during World War II. The poem The Danubian Principality's Horse was written in Bucharest in 1939 during a meeting of the Balkan Entente. At this point, Italy had already invaded Albania, and the Balkan countries of Greece, Yugoslavia, Romania, and Turkey were trying to decide if they were going to maintain the peace agreement they shared after World War I. By the time the diplomats made it to Bucharest, the war was already on their heels. The Danubian Principality's Horse, a Caprice by Matthew Pascalis. A slope, a spear, a tree. On the other side, a horse. In the space between flow bodies, women's fragrances, men, neither joyful nor glum, decided rather than decisive. Perhaps the others decide for them, the two kings, the one inhabiting a bronze form, and the other who inhabits a flesh form. Perhaps the two kings decide, or the horse. His chasm of a belly is so lightly elevated on four legs. The sound of his feet clip-clopping on the pavement excites us. The horror is never revealed. We never see the great fishhook catching us from the rusted red pier. When you notice terror's presence, you also catch sight of death. A hook-shaped sperm bursts forth from his petrifying testicles and resounds deeply, like an indifferent cannon at a stately home in Idra. This seed of death never fails to embed itself in those who are marked. They are dragged like Achilles did Hector, on his back, in the dust, pale, naked, humiliated, past embroidered and flickering neon signs, past women's exhausted breasts, love's stagnant ditches. Through burning tires and automobile exhaust, through oppressive heat and military regiments presenting their weapons while bugles hover. Surely the dead are returned to the belly of the horse, even while the dead king also rides on the horse's back, a monstrous lump. And the horse's nostrils flare in revulsion. A ritual unfolds, soundless and unknown, an offering to the man who held the globe and scepter, an offering to the horse within the man. The horse whinnies and bloodies his hooves, unsatisfied even now that the rider has alchemized sleep. A ritual unfolds, devoid of priestly movements, no torches, no official rites, rather a ritual done in our pedestrian ways, with our micro-afflictions and impersonal joys. Our brow furrowed as usual when we answer the ringing phone, with our tired eyes and handshake jerky when we meet someone. A sick procession held in the temporary, staged world order. During the German occupation of Greece, Seferis spent most of this time in Egypt, where the Greek prime minister and royal family first evacuated to in 1941. And there he witnessed the impotence of the Greek heads of state, as well as the violence of the North African theater of war. While in Egypt, he wrote a lot of rhyming satiric poems about the dissonance he witnessed living among the disaffected elites, while the common people of so many countries suffered the consequences of the global war. And this next poem is modeled after T.S. Eliot's unfinished jazz-inspired drama, Sweeney Agonistes. Chorale from Matthew Pascalis, Prisoner of War. Under the under the E, child he is destroyed. Child he is destroyed. Under the babul tree, a bam, a boom, suddenly out of 10 remained 3. Child he is wiped out, scraped. And then out of 3 remained 1, 10, 3, not even a soul. There were the jacaranda flowers and a small fleet anchors. A felucca plies the Nile, like an African woman swelling with child. Under the under the E, under the babul tree, a bam, a boom. Suddenly, we've shit ourselves. A piggish face like a seal with a corn cob from Zamalek will come to feed you. When you're hungry, they'll be back with only sugar cane to champ. Don't you see the multitudes battling death and our misery? Stop flapping your tongue. Stop circling like a hen with no brood, day and eve under the babul tree, with a bam and a boom. There's a villa in Zamalek, where the crimson leaves are like a unicorn's tongue, licking the heavens. I want to know the secrets of their ancient cothurnus boots, how they elevate the wearer without sweat and elbow grease, and then are destroyed. Without sorrows and passion, they are destroyed. The falcons sink into the horizon under the babul tree, with a bam, with a boom. Many people remember Seferis' poetry for years without regularly engaging with it. His voice always throbs with an unfulfilled longing and a sadness that readers recognize within themselves, even if at times the images, references, or context of the poems may seem mystifying. His poetry leaves the reader with that unfulfilled longing, which pulls them back to the poems again and again. There's also a quality of prophecy in Seferis' work. He is narrating a future based on the past, which he is powerless to change, despite being one of the few people with the power to be present at key historical moments. His poetry speaks to the way that memory works within us, fragmented, ripe with emotions and details, seemingly present but inaccessible. And I'll conclude now with 2 poems that reflect this quality of the past in the present and prophecy. These poems, though they were written at the beginning of the Greek Civil War in 1945, feel as if they are speaking to our moment in time. The Blind Man. Sleep is heavy on December mornings, black like the waters of the Acheron, without dreams, without memory, without even a tiny laurel leaf. Waking gouges oblivion like flogged skin, and the errant soul comes to the surface, holding shards of unearthed images. A dancing girl with useless castanets, with feet that falter, with ankles bruised from the heavy trampling down where the annihilated gather. Sleep is heavy on December mornings, and each December is worse than the last. One year it's Parga, the next it's Syracuse. The ancestors' bones are exhumed, minds are filled with exhausted souls, crippled, without breath. And blood is bought and blood is sold, spread around like the children of Oedipus, and the children of Oedipus are dead. Empty streets, pockmarked facades, iconolators and iconoclasts slaughter each other all night. Latched shutters. Within the room, the scant light burrowed into corners like a blind pigeon. And him, groping, he found his way through the vast meadow and saw the darkness behind the light. Postscript to Gymnopedia, January 1945. The sea that took you far away, soft as a mother's breast, it knows. The things you questioned as a child are now the mumblings of old men, fantasies of useless objects, the sealed trunks of drowned sailors. Look, they fear the light of the sun. They're afraid to see. They babble. They have nothing else. Some children grow up hungry, uprooting trees, devastating mountains. Others ask questions and get answers. Why did they get one step ahead? Up or down? I don't know, it makes no difference. Still, they have many fires to light for the feast of St. John. Once upon a time, I said blood brings blood and more blood. They took it as the performance of a buffoon, useless fairy tales. Still, I would whisper, stones are heavy, and the millstones are unliftable. You heard them grinding to a halt one night on the edge of time. Then, tragically, young bodies drowned. Worn out rags, said the sorcerers. But how will we dress in the cold when we have nothing new? And what will you say to your friends when they are sorrowful and fall silent, and the passionate songs delight only bores? Still, this too I said, you should perceive life's moments. You should discern the wind shaking the roses from the roses in a tiny garden no larger than a handful of earth. This I tried to do, I would say, not as the mind's recollection, but as a matter of breathing, for me, for you, or better yet, as a kind of voicing. The wind is a passing voice. The sea took you far away and brought you back to the familiar port, granting you the silence beyond the docks, the boundless midday silence. The sea knows how to teach you the mysteries of Good Friday and Easter. Thank you. Thank you for listening. Thank you, Anastasia, for being here with me.
Yeah. Thanks for inviting me, Jenny. And thank you. Can we do one more round of applause for that? I go to a lot of poetry readings, and it's really nice to have someone actually explain the context for the poems in between. And so just thank you for that really graceful context building and beautiful reading. It was really lovely.
Thank you.
So I have a bunch of questions for you, and you mentioned a couple of things that I want to follow up on, if that's okay, during your powders. You spoke a little bit about how you found your way to Seferis, but you were working on this for a long time. What kept you in it for all those years? Yeah.
Well, I discovered George Seferis's poetry in my junior year abroad in Athens in 1996. And at the same time, I learned about the tragedy, one of the tragedies that I mentioned in the reading, which was the Asia Minor catastrophe, which was at the end of World War I. Greece and Turkey, what became Turkey, had an exchange of populations, and millions of Greek Orthodox Christians were uprooted from their homes and sent to live in Greece as destitute refugees. And so that historical event became an obsession for me. And at the same time, I started reading Seferis's poetry, and I began a dialogue with him, with the dead poet. I mean, I really did. I have notebooks from the 90s of, questions I had and theories, and, I've really just been in dialogue with him in my head for most of my adult life. And I like to joke that, I mean, between my husband and George Seferis are the two men I know the best. It's really true. And I had this conviction that his words were relevant, and that I could learn both about myself, about poetry, about Greece and Greek, and improve my Greek, and about this historical event that was only talked about and presented in a particular way in Greek culture through his poetry. And so it really has been my enduring obsession. And I'm not ashamed to admit it.
Sound like a true academic. Okay, so I have two questions that are related to that, and they're like both good competing for attention there. So I think I'm going to go with one of the things that really struck me about this manuscript is exactly that history of being torn between this Ottoman, this Turkish heritage, this tragic fall of the Ottoman Empire, and then the way that these populations are shifted. I was really struck by the way you described him as a refugee artist, and how that doesn't seem to be present in the literature, and that doesn't really seem to be a way that he's framed by scholars. So I was kind of curious, how does Seferis himself sort of deal with that, especially since he ends up being a champion and a sort of folk hero for Greek language and Greek heritage, despite having this like heritage that was kind of pulled away from him? And I was curious how he deals with that. How do you see him dealing with that?
Yeah. Well, he becomes the national poet par excellence. He advocates for the nation in his daily life. And then in his private life, he writes and rewrites the history and the culture of the nation. And, there was a movement that he was a part of called the generation of the 30s, many of whom were Asia Minor Greeks. And so I think they tried to work out some of their identity issues in that way. But you're right that he was never considered a refugee poet, because in the refugee discourse, everyone who was from a different region of Turkey represented themselves as being part of that village or that community. And he never developed an identity that was based on the past. And so he, I think the way he coped with it was by being a champion for folk culture, which of course having, as you know, in like modernist European poetry was a way that that European artists tried to cope with both globalization and creating a national identity during all of the upheaval of the 20th century. So there's that tension. And he really, I will say though, if you would like to go online and read his Nobel speech, he talks about the village he grew up in Turkey, and his Nobel speech, and kind of dedicates, you might say, the prize and his speech to the forgotten people, and those people who were creating what he values in Greek culture, kind of the folk culture. And so I don't know, the tension just exists through all of his work and all of his life. And it's one of the things that I find creatively generative for me as a translator and as someone who's obsessed with him.
Yeah, I think it also shows up in the ways that he's constantly blending different histories, stories, folk tales, things like that. That kind of that modernist cosmopolitanism shows up in a lot of different ways, not just in this kind of being torn between two locations, but also between these multiple traditions. So it's interesting that he does get kind of located as a folk hero since he is reaching so many different places. I was really glad to hear you read the last chorus because I love that opening line. The first line about that in that references altered folk tales. And so I was wondering if that might be a framework for us to think through being caught between two places or pulling from all these cosmopolitanisms. I was curious about that choice in your translation, altered folk tales, but also that as a framework.
Yeah, that's what the Greek says. And that was one of the first poems I translated from the book and I used in my dissertation. And I think it shows no other scholar has ever pointed that out, like looked at that poem and shown that this offers a perspective, because when Seferis's work was being translated and studied, he was very much presented as the heir to T.S. Eliot and like myth as high culture and high art. And so his skepticism about that and his way of looking at this, I mean, to me, the last chorus also talks about in ancient Greek culture and drama, there's a story of this idea of blood pollution. Alex might know what I'm talking about.
Not as well as you.
But the idea that after killing of Clytemnestra, all the descendants are poisoned by association, and like there's this poison in their energy. It's like karma, that ancestral karma that's handed down. And so to me, the irony of that poem is saying we're paying off an altered folktale, but also we're literally poisoned by it. And so it also expresses the tension that the Greek nation, everyone in modern Greece has to live through, which is the fact that in order to get their independence from the Ottomans, they needed to justify their glorious ancient past and sacrifice their true culture, the culture of the moment that's more influenced by Byzantium and Anatolia and Eastern elements, a multicultural society, in favor of privileging this idealized glorious ancient culture. And so to me, that's what that poem talks about, that tension.
Oh, yeah. My heart hurts even just thinking about that, right? How much you have to give up. I'm gonna ask some of my dorkier questions. I'm so sorry in advance. These are really dorky. Because you mentioned at the beginning of that, when I said that the poem opens with altered folktales. Well, that's just what the Greek says. After working with translators at Open Letter and elsewhere, one of my favorite things to hear about is unique features of a language. And you said that this is part of how you learned Greek, was translating these poems. So I'm curious what kind of exciting but also difficult things you might have encountered while you were doing your translation. So some poets I've encountered talk about how translating from Russian to English is really difficult because Russian has flexible sentence structure. English has very rigid sentence structure. So there are certain compromises you have to make. And I'm curious, what are some of the standard difficulties you deal with moving Greek into English? And then I'm going to ask you more specifically about Seferis himself.
Yeah. I think one of the biggest challenges in this book was meter. And practically every poem in this book is written in a particular meter that he chose. And I would not say meter is my strong suit. So that was very difficult for me. Like, do I keep the Greek meter? Do I find a meter in English that works? But so that was one challenge. And I'll just say on that point that many of the poems in this book, he was trying to write in a parody of British English. And limerick and rhyme, because he was really angry at the British.
Fair.
And influenced by them at the same time. Yeah. So that was one challenge. I think the sound of Greek is so different than English, and because so many of these poems are rhyming, it was just very challenging to come up with, like, to reproduce the rhyme. I don't know. I've been so immersed in Greek that I don't really think of like, oh, there's tense and syntax challenges for the English. For English, it's just like I just think of what it is in English and keep up with it.
Yeah.
So I don't know. That wasn't the hardest part for me.
Interesting.
The hardest part was the meter.
Okay.
And then also, there were a lot of poems where he was trying to do something, he was trying to be very clever and nasty.
My next question is about puns, so.
And so like, there's one poem that was written entirely with Sanskrit words. Because he wanted, this was after his first book had come out and he didn't get good reviews. And he wanted to tell people to screw off with the poems. And so the critics said that his first poetry book was just a book of words that didn't make any sense. And so he wrote a poem of words that were all Sanskrit words.
Interesting.
And the punchline was that he found the Sanskrit word for the amalaki tree, and in Greek, asshole is malaka. And so it was like, in English, that was, I don't know, it's really hard to get the punchline.
Yeah. That was one of my favorite poems. It's the Indian folktale poem.
Yeah.
And at the end of that, you can see it in the Greek that the letters are the same. And then I read your footnote and was like, that must have been a mess for you to try to figure out.
Yeah.
What were some of the rejected solutions?
Oh, God, I remember.
Yeah.
It was just, it had to be that way. Like,
Yeah.
it just had to be the way at the end. Like, you have to say those assholes.
You have to say those assholes. There's no way around it.
And there wasn't a word to rhyme with assholes.
I guess there's not. No, I guess it's like orange, right? Or silver. There's no rhyme for that.
Yeah.
Okay. Excellent. One of the other like major stylistic features that shows up coming into English is the time stamping, right? Which you mentioned in the beginning and comes up a lot when you're reading about him online. But I found that really interesting because so much of the modernist project is often about trying to be eternal or exist out of time, or like all of history needs to be combined in this poem, thanks pound in those cantos. So I'm kind of wondering, since he seems to almost be, he's obviously in dialogue with that, but he's also sort of resisting it. And I was just kind of curious what you think put that push against this totalizing long durée history of poetry. What was that impulse? What is he doing there?
Well, it's interesting because he has that with the Mythistorima.
Right.
And that's his only poem that does that, but it's what made him famous.
Of course it was.
And the interesting thing is that poem was written when he was back in Greece. Like, he basically wrote a lot of his most famous poetry when he was back in Greece on sabbaticals and had time to write. And so when he had time to write, he would like create those modernist big pieces. But the rest of it was really just written, on the road and with certain circumstances. And so for me, I feel like the timestamp is about movement and the movement through his life, and him telling himself that it's still valuable because he longed to be a great poet. When he was like 12, he wanted to be a great poet. That was his goal in life. Yeah. And so I think it's about remembering that you can still, that your poems still matter. And the time stamping it's a feature of his work. If you look in his collected works, he puts the year and sometimes the place where he wrote most of it. And it's true. I mean, it was about his life and the moments that he experienced and created in his life. So I like considering that it goes against the modernist, diachronic, nowhere.
Yeah.
Utopia.
Yes.
It
got, yeah, it felt like that to me. So it's interesting. Of course, his most famous work would be the one that's in dialogue with that. So it's useful that this is sort of resisting this a little bit, which leads me to another question I have about this book in particular, because this book feels like it resists being read in a lot of ways that that other modernist texts would, or like a collected would, right? Because it is pieces of a lot of different texts and kind of ephemera. And I was curious about the curation. I think of it as a curated volume, right? Curated by him, curated by you. And I'm curious about how do you read a text that's curated? Do you read it from cover to cover? This is an ongoing debate in poetry land. Do you read a book? Do you start on page 1 and you go to the end?
Yes.
Do you pick? There are very strong opinions about this question. I'd be curious what Jenny has to say. Or do you kind of pick and choose a little bit? Or do you think you read chronologically? I mean, especially since the timeline goes to one and it disrupts in the middle. I'm curious how do you read this text?
Well, I think most people just open it up. Everyone I've spoken to who's read it just kind of thumbs through it.
Yeah.
But then when you go back and read the introduction, maybe then you start to get a sense of what the pieces are. So the pieces are a set of poems that are taken from his diaries during World War II, a compilation of things that he wrote between 1931 and 1971, which is just sort of everything. And then a set of poems that were all pen and ink drawings written in Egypt during the war. And they're very different. I don't know that you could even pick them up and kind of thumb through them. You have to know what it is. So my feeling is you hunt and peck.
Okay.
And maybe you read the introduction first to get a sense of what you're doing.
Okay. Two directions, but you just left me about these. So if everybody has your copy, it's the last section of the book. These like kind of drawn, right? I almost read them like, if you know Apollinaire's collograms, they kind of look like that. They're sort of concrete-y poetry looking. At first they sort of look like letters, sort of not. It's kind of hard to locate them. And so I was just curious if you could comment a little bit more about these. Do we read them as do you read them as images? Do you read them as doodles? How do you read them? And then how did you translate them into standard prose, like lineated poetry?
Okay, so actually, just before I get to that, to go back to the previous question.
Yeah.
I did not create the sections of the book.
Okay.
Seferis' editor Seferis did.
Okay.
And he took everything that was left, everything that Seferis had done up until the point he died for this book, and put it together. And in the Greek original, it does have, someone did transcribe those drawings, and or maybe Seferis himself had left a transcription and with versification and put them in the book. So I read the images as images. I don't read them as poems.
Okay.
And I think that they're there to inspire you to try to find the poem image.
Interesting. So you think, okay, that's really cool. So you don't read like lineation or enjambment or anything in these.
I mean, it's there, but no.
Interesting.
I think it's there, it's the shape rather than the lineation.
And do we have an idea of why he was writing these in Egypt when he was writing them?
Oh, I can't say for sure, but I think it was a way of coping with the pain.
And then this kind of leads to my other question. Is his voice consistent in these poems too, even when the image is so dominant here? Does he still have this voice? You mentioned that you know his voice very well at this point. You've been having conversations with him for a long time. Is the voice in these poems consistent along with everything else?
Absolutely.
Yeah?
Totally.
Wild. And then my question is, how would you describe his voice? And for those of us kind of looking, you mentioned in your introduction that there's a lot of different pieces here, but what you strove for was a consistency of voice and personality. How would you describe his voice and personality, and what stylistic features kind of show up in the poems that we could look for?
Yeah, so when I wrote my dissertation, I spent something like 15 years privately translating Seferis' poetry for my dissertation. That will never see the light of day until it goes into the public domain, because his official translators, Healy and Sherrard, they held the copyright on that. But I had to find my way of rendering his voice. And because he uses consistent images and words across all of his poetry for his whole life, I didn't want to be like, oh, this time when I sit down, I'm going to translate it into one word in English in another time. So for me, his voice is resigned, dour, direct, but transcendent, and mystical, the undertones. And so I tried to think of, I'm gonna be honest, like a 65-year-old Greek man talking to me. And how would I be that person?
Yeah.
How would I inhabit that if I had lived through all of these things? You know, so, and I can't deny that it isn't mixed with my own poetic voice and who I am as a poet and my own speech pattern. But yeah, it's very halted, but direct. I don't know if you have a comment, if you would like to share how you perceive the voice.
I perceive the voice as very wry, and I was really struck by these kind of long listing kind of lines, these lines that kind of fell into each other and were constantly kind of accruing. And so I was curious about, is that a kind of wisdom? Is that a kind of desire to want to know more? A desire to kind of constantly want to engage?
On his part?
Yeah.
I think that it's like he's tumbling out the images from his memory. That there's like this is what I remember, this is what it's like, this is what it feels like, and it just kind of unspools. Yeah. But related to the voice, because in this book he inhabits many other characters, then I had to figure out how does Seferis inhabit a character.
Yeah.
And so that was also fun.
Yeah, there are a lot of characters in the book. You get to know a lot of people in the book, not just Seferis. So I can only imagine. I just want to keep an eye on time, and I know we are at 4:03. So did you want to open? I can keep going, but I figured there might be other questions in the audience, maybe about characters or about Ottoman history.
Yeah. Are there questions? Yes, Allison.
Not so much a question, but an observation, because you touched on Pound, and I just kept thinking Pound when I was listening to you. There are some poems that remind me so much of the very deceptively simple translations from the Chinese. And then, of course, with the whole mythic kind of narrative moving through, although I feel like I'm hearing more questions in Seferis versus certitudes in Pound. But you know, I don't know if there were many influences or what, you know, where what he was taking in around that time. But there was a resonance for me, not derivative in any way, but it seemed important in terms of where they were in the centuries and the historic events that they had witnessed, and one being an American who was, you know, lived abroad. But if you can comment on that.
Yes, so Seferis was fluent in French and English by the time he was in his early 20s. And he read a lot of British, maybe some American, but more British poetry. And and French poetry. So Eliot, Pound, Valerie, and there's someone whose name always escapes me. He read a lot of that, and he wanted to bring it into Greek poetry. And also, as I mentioned, because of the language, what they call the language question.
Yeah.
You know, I think that those writers, Pound and
Eliot and others influenced him.
Yeah.
And how he wanted to create.
Right.
And he, you know, kind of wanted to break new ground.
Yeah.
In Greece.
Yeah, it was the choice of the language, some of the, yeah, the absolute, you know, I think of it as so contemporary, I mean, in a way, I just can still read some of the modernist works and it just, it's so fresh, you know. Thank you.
I'll try one. What's meter?
Meter is the length of the line and a particular rhythm of the line. So, what's a?
So often it's taught with iambic pentameter, meter.
iambic pentameter.
So to be or not to be, that is, you,
So the
You-
rhythm of the line,
the stress syllables. Yeah.
stress, yes. Mona.
So maybe in these poems more than the constructed ones, I'm assuming there's this for writers as well as composers. Some are known for sort of writing something out fluently and just having it out, and some are sketchers and erasers, and we have a lot of sort of their scribbled approach. I was wondering if Seferis was sort of leaning one or the other, and if these poems were different than his more larger scale kind of works that have to be big stories.
That's a good question. I think he tended to write full drafts. And work out ideas in a complete poem or a couple of stanzas, because he kept diaries and all the diaries are in print. And there is actually a lot more material you could pull from the diaries if anyone ever was allowed to. Yeah. And when you look at his process, you can see that he generally created something in one go, did a few edits, and then moved on.
It's really struck by the idea that that one work that you said you had another version where you thought about using one whole story as the basis and then use another classic Greek story. I'm trying to remember which one.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, so that's one of the more interesting ones, that he ended up choosing the Odyssey and choosing a different landscape. But those two poems come from his diaries from that time, and you can really see the evolution of his process through that. Good question.
I think we could conclude.
Oh, wait, one more question.
Oh,
for
there's a
you.
question. I'm sorry.
That's awesome. But I'm curious how his official translators, one, are they still alive? No. But you know, that legacy, like how it's interacted with your translation and new and exciting and, you know, ignored, heretofore ignored work.
Well, before Edmund Keeley died, I asked for his blessing to translate this. And he gave it to me and he was like, great, go ahead. I personally think that Seferis's work could benefit, more of it could benefit from retranslation. Because his work was translated in English starting in maybe the early 50s. And it was all done by white men. And it just has a particular, you know, I mean, they were translating his work to promote Greece and to get this certain version of Greece out into the world, and it worked. He became famous, he won the Nobel Prize, people love his work. There's nothing wrong with those translations, but I mean, I'm a person who spent my entire adult life developing my Seferis voice, so I think it could be, there is room for more.
Yeah, and emphasize those other perspectives.
Yeah.
I think Lauren, I don't want to cut anyone off, but one more. Okay.
That's very interesting, because when you were reading up there and talking about the myths that he was employing, this often new life is breathed into these myths. But I'm wondering, to what extent is he sort of modernizing the myths or criticizing Philhellenism and the ways that like British authors are using these myths as, you know, like good old Greece and forgetting that modern Greece actually exists.
Yeah, he definitely sought to modernize the myths. And he chose certain characters and tropes and figures to represent modern Greek life. But it was always with this bitter irony, like kind of like the heroes who didn't make it to be a hero type of thing. He was very critical of the tourism industry and popular Greek culture, which, you know, kind of makes him feel like, oh, is he just this sort of old, I don't know, dour fuddy-duddy? But at the same time, I feel like he, you know, he had some reason to, because he could see the exploitation going.
Thank you both so much.